How many of you actually work on energy in your day job? Any energy startups? Okay, quite a few. How many of you think that the energy transition is in super safe hands and nothing will possibly be able to derail it? Okay. How many of you think that there are forces on this planet willing to derail the energy transition? Okay, you're all politically minded, so you're exactly the kinds of people I want to talk to. You've heard this, right? We cannot change the worst impacts of climate change anyway, so we should better adapt to the new realities. And what's more, the energy transition is too expensive. We all know that. Wind and sun are not always available. How do I continue? Fossil fuels and nuclear energy, on the contrary, are available. They are affordable. They ensure stability, prosperity, growth. And since we're in Germany, we all know Germany is only responsible for about 2% of global emissions. China, on the contrary, is responsible for 27%. And it won't make any difference to the climate if we in this country decarbonize and thereby destroy our wealth. These arguments are very catchy again these days. I'm not making this up. Climate is not very high on people's or politicians' agenda at the moment. And it's kind of obvious why this is. There's the cost of living crisis, there's the economic downturn, a multitude of societal problems, like we're facing issues integrating increasing numbers of migrants in our society. By the way, public infrastructure is falling apart, including our schools. Plus obviously the overall speed of change, and people just can't keep up. Now, one would think that come the next elections in this country or anywhere else in Europe, people will vote climate out of office. But hang on a second, is it really that easy? And what I did here is I brought you some very recent polling data from this year, some from the EU, some from Germany. And you can see it's not that bad. Look, 85% of EU citizens think that the EU should invest massively in renewable energy. 77% of EU citizens think that climate change is a very serious problem. And they actually mostly ranked the seriousness of climate change between 7 and 10 on a scale to 10. And 65% of EU citizens think that their government is not doing enough to tackle climate change. So what was that about voting climate change, voting climate policy out of office come next elections? Now, of course, the support for climate policy is more ambitious, is higher in the north and the west of Europe, much lower in the south and in the east. But let's have a bit of a deep dive into Germany. The vast majority of people, and depending on the poll, it's about 86 and 91% of people who support the energy transition and an economic transformation towards climate neutrality. And you know what's interesting? Ever since we've had war back on the European continent just next door, acceptance for renewable energy went up quite significantly. So, for example, 20% of the population in Germany who were not a fan of wind energy or any renewables before the crisis, they now believe it should be expanded. They now believe it should be welcomed. And the same poll found that 2/3 of people think that renewables in their direct neighborhoods, remember the NIMBY, not in my backyard problem? 2/3 of people now think that wind parks in their immediate neighborhood, they're either good or very good. And support actually keeps increasing once people have experience with renewables in their neighborhood. So, there's strong support for the energy transition despite all the other problems that are really preoccupying people. But here is the caveat. What's that 39%? These are people who are afraid of a declining socioeconomic status. They are afraid that climate policy will impact negatively in economic terms and in social terms on their own reality. And this figure goes up when you look at people who have got low capital income, not so wealthy people. This percentage actually goes up. So half of the population, this segment, they say, well, you know what? We're not against ambitious climate action, but the problem is that climate policy and the energy transition, they scare me because they could mean less prospects for a positive economic future for myself and for my family and for my children, despite the fact that my children will likely suffer more from the impacts of climate change once they're grown-ups. Another poll actually makes this clear as well. KfW, Germany's promotional bank, they raised figures recently, and it turned out that 41% of people living in their own homes, you would think people living in their own homes, they are probably economically really well off. Well, actually 41% feel not able to afford things like new windows or insulation or heat pumps or solar PV. Someone has to pay for this before it actually pays off. At the same time, among those people, 9 out of 10 still support the energy transition. So the solution seems really simple. We have to make it affordable to be pro-climate. We have to make it affordable to be pro-renewables. So I think the conclusion is very clear. I don't have polling data on me today from other European countries, but we have to make the energy transition socially and economically affordable. And at the same time, we have to make sure that social justice increases at the same time as we're moving towards climate neutrality. Climate change, again, is something that just costs me money and that has no other benefits to me. I'm not very likely to support the agenda as highly as I think about climate policy in theory otherwise. Now, why am I talking to you like this? You all know this anyway. It's probably nothing very new. But we are entering really dangerous territory here, I argue. Because people's fears and people's uncertainties are now being exploited by two groups. And the first group are fossil fuel companies. Might not come as a surprise to you. The age of coal is now over forever in Europe. But the profits of big oil and gas have been soaring ever since Russia's horrific war of aggression against Ukraine. And no corporate, no petrostate on earth would publicly state that they are against the energy transition. But if you look carefully, there is a caveat about that. There's a lot of talk about natural gas being a bridge fuel, a Brückentechnologie to a carbon-neutral future. Ahead of the upcoming International Climate Summit, COP28 in Dubai, we see a new, really lively debate coming up on carbon capture storage, CCS, to prolong the life of a fossil fuel economy, and in particular gas. So what's more, the gas bridge would actually require excess imports of LNG, liquefied natural gas. This would mean increasing cost. It would mean new geoeconomic risks because we are now dependent on not Russia anymore, but other not so democratic regimes in the world. So I would argue LNG is a bridge to nowhere. And I think we should all be aware of this. Also, the oil and gas industry is embracing a vision of a hydrogen economy, but on the condition that hydrogen can be produced from natural gas rather than renewables. And natural gas really is a euphemism in this case, because natural gas mostly consists of methane. It's a short-lived climate forcer, it's a greenhouse gas, and the effects of methane are actually 80 times greater for the first 20 years that methane is in the atmosphere than of CO2. So methane is worse than CO2. And then there is an additional dynamic that turns people's fears of the energy transition into political opinion. Now, climate action has now been hijacked by right-wing forces in the culture war, the Kulturkampf, where it clearly doesn't belong. Now, just this spring in Germany, most of you will remember this, you could see right-wing media trying to copy well-established mechanisms from the United States, fighting climate policy. How did this happen? Well, a half-cooked version of a new so-called heating law was leaked to the press. It was not the final law, it was a draft. Really badly crafted, but still it was leaked, and then it sparked big public debate. And what happened is that some right-wing media outlets organized public outcry by suggesting that the government would actually force people to tear out the existing heating and thereby impoverish hard-working citizens. And the recipe is always the same. You mix facts with fiction, you convey a distorted image about the actual situation, you make it clear who the culprits, the real culprits are, and obviously you say that this is all happening to undermine the lives and the livelihoods of hard-working people, normal people. But as bad as the draft legislation was, its content was obviously not the result of a conspiracy of some woke green forces that are controlled by the interests of BlackRock and US big business. Now, this kind of public mudslinging is obviously really bad for business. Now, unfortunately, across Europe, there's now a lot of talk about doing less on climate and on reprioritizing the political agenda. Another person must have seen this coming, Ursula von der Leyen. Some of you might have followed her speech yesterday morning, State of the European Union address. In that address, she started out making an economic case for climate neutrality. That was the first 2 paragraphs of a 1-hour-plus speech yesterday. She went back to the European Green Deal, 2019. It was born out of the necessity to save the planet, but the Green Deal now is about so much more. It has given Europe a sense of direction, that's a quote, a sense of direction for innovation and investment. And modernization, she said, and decarbonization go hand in hand. Now that's EU programming now, and that's really heartening. And I should also say, from my perspective, doing all this transition stuff, it can be so much fun, and the Impact Festival is proof of that. And yet, given the recent devastating forest fires, the floodings, the loss of lives, the destruction of infrastructure and wealth, I wonder, are we doing enough? And is this actually about saving the climate? Is it not rather about safeguarding opportunities for future generations and about preserving the very foundations of a free democracy, of a free society and liberal democracy? Now, I'm usually the first one to be depressed about the state of the world, but then I remind myself of what we have achieved already. And I realize, you know what? The facts are not as bad as it seems. And here's my message for you today. So maybe what we need is simply a new story about the energy transition and about a regenerative economy. You've all been bombarded in a very positive sense with ideas. You've been in exchanges. You've come up with new business ideas. This is executive fuel we need to bring the energy transition back on track. And I believe that all of you have a role in this. So we need this reset. And I tell you why I believe it's totally possible. Now, in the EU, renewables alone have contributed greenhouse gas emissions reductions of 14.6% between 2005 and 2021. Renewables play a huge role in decarbonizing the European economy. In 2022, all member states, actually except France, reached the targets they had set for themselves for renewable energy. So European governments are delivering on their commitments. In 2022, 39% of our electricity in the EU came from renewables. The slide is from 2020. That was still 37.5%. It shows you the rollout is really accelerating. And in 2022, because of the horrible war next door, Europe was able to reduce 20% of its overall energy demand, and that was not only electricity. Now, so much more is possible. And EU-wide, that's important as well, we are still spending incredible amounts of money every year on imported fossil fuels. Actually, almost 60% of fossil fuel energy is imported. In 2018, so pre-crisis, the price tag was a staggering 331 million euros. During the crisis year, and this is not official stats yet from the EU, but I did found a statistic from the United States, it was 500 billion euros. So, in my opinion, we're just burning money there. One could argue that every single euro that we are burning on fossil fuels right now could be invested in renewables, in new energy infrastructure, in batteries, in storage systems, in digital solutions to save energy. Could do so much more with the money. And then also think jobs. In 2019, we had 4.5 million green jobs in the European economy. And that was up quite significantly from only 2000, when there was only 3.2 million jobs. So jobs are increasing in the millions in the industries delivering for the energy transition. And with the opportunities emerging from green hydrogen, just imagine all of these positive prospects, they are still going up. Let's not forget that the German steel industry is committed to producing green steel through use of green hydrogen. This will have dramatic effects on carbon emissions. And in the past 5 years, the number of green steel factories has gone up from 0 to 38 in the European Union. And I could go on and on. There are plans to produce green e-fuels for the aviation industry in Europe. So this is about technological leadership, and therefore it's also about significant revenue. Now, further opportunities emerge from onshoring the solar value chain in Germany and Europe in the next 2 years. In 2025, we want to have 30 gigawatts of annual solar PV energy manufacturing here in Europe. And once investors can be certain that the European governments and the European Commission will deliver on their commitments, once they see that renewables and regenerative economy actually work, I'm sure the tides will turn again in a really positive way. And it's not about crude figures I'm presenting to you today. We need a positive story about succeeding the transition. It's about so much more than just CO2, and it's about everything I just spoke about. It's about job opportunities, it's about prosperity, it's about, actually, it's also about civic engagement, because as I showed to you, liberal democracy and a free society, they go hand in hand with this transition. It's about people taking an interest, it's about people taking a stance, including where you work, at your workplace. You might be talking to the converted on a daily basis, but there's so many people out there that you can reach, not only with your products, with the services, but through your voice. And I hope you will all find your voice in this. And I hope you will find your audience to play your role in succeeding the energy transition. Thank you so much.